Some stories do not begin with great events. They begin with small silences. Silences that no one notices. Silences that make no noise, yet hurt. Silences that accumulate inside someone until they become part of who that person is. This is the story of a boy who did not draw attention for what he did, but for what he avoided. A boy who learned early that existing too much could be dangerous, that being seen, at times, hurt more than being ignored. It is also the story of how time can be cruel, but when it finds someone willing to endure, it can become fair. Before becoming an admired man, before becoming a respected name, before becoming someone the world listened to, Clark was just a boy trying to go unnoticed, and not even that was allowed to him. Clark walked through the school hallways like someone crossing enemy territory. There was no declared war. There were no constant shouts or shoving all the time. But there was something worse. Looks. Looks that measured, that evaluated, that decided in silence that he did not belong there. He was too tall for his age, so tall that he always seemed hunched over as if trying to shrink his own size. Thin to the point that his clothes never seemed right, always too loose in some places, too tight in others. His face bore acne that insisted on appearing on the worst days, and the braces on his teeth shone whenever he dared to smile, which happened less and less. Clark was not ugly, but he was not handsome in the way the school accepted either. And in that environment, that was enough. His awkward manner drew attention. His long arms seemed not to know where to rest. His hands were never comfortable, sometimes in his pockets, sometimes crossed, sometimes too restless. Even walking seemed wrong, as if every step were being watched, judged, and somewhere a reason for laughter. He felt it, even when no one said anything. In the classroom, Clark always chose the desks farthest away, not because he liked the back, but because there he drew less attention. He sat up straight at the beginning of the day, trying to look confident, but as the hours passed, his shoulders began to sink, as if his own body were learning to protect itself. The laughter came in waves, sometimes low, almost imperceptible, other times clear enough for him to know the subject was him. Look at how big he is. He looks like a scarecrow. That guy will never get anyone. The words were rarely spoken directly to his face. It was not necessary. They reached him anyway. The girls looked away when Clark passed by. Some whispered, others pretended he did not exist. None wanted to be seen near him, as if simple proximity could compromise their social standing. In group projects, Clark was always left alone, or included only when there was no other option, and he accepted it, not because he agreed, but because he had already learned that complaining only made things worse. Clark began to understand early on that there were people made to be noticed, and people made to occupy corners. He was the second type. During recess, while groups formed naturally, loud laughter, friendly shoves, shared stories, Clark wandered without a clear destination. He carried a simple snack in his hands, more out of habit than hunger. He sat on empty benches. He changed places when someone approached to avoid awkward looks. Sometimes he pretended to be too busy with a book. Other times he simply stared at the ground. It was safer that way. Teachers saw him as a model student, polite, punctual, always with his assignments done. But few truly saw him. To many, Clark was just the quiet kid. No one stopped to ask why he was quiet, or how much effort that silence required. At home, he hardly talked about school. He answered with short sentences. said everything was fine, that it was nothing serious. And in a way, it really wasn't, because for Clark, it had already become routine. What hurt most were not the laughs, nor the nicknames, nor the explicit exclusion. What hurt was the constant feeling of inadequacy, of being wrong, of taking up too much space without offering anything that justified that space. He wondered in silence what was wrong with him, if it was his body, his manner, his face, or something deeper that he did not yet know how to name. With time, Clark developed a skill no one taught him, the ability to disappear even while being present. He learned to walk more slowly, to speak more softly, to avoid drawing attention. He learned that the less he spoke, the less he would be noticed, and the less he was noticed, the smaller the pain would be. Silence became his armor, an invisible armor, heavy but necessary. Clark didn't dream big at that time. He didn't make grand plans. His greatest desire was simple: to go unnoticed, to survive one more day of school, and then another, and then another. Without knowing that, in that imposed silence, he was being shaped, not broken, and that without realizing it, he was learning a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes staying silent isn't weakness, it's survival. Recess always began the same way for Clark, with relief and anxiety at the same time. Relief because for a few minutes he did not have to pretend to pay attention in class. Anxiety because that was the moment when the school showed who truly belonged to it and who merely occupied space. As soon as the bell rang, the hallways filled with voices, loud laughter, hasty footsteps, excited calls. Groups formed almost automatically, as if everyone already knew exactly where they were supposed to be. Clark watched all of this from a distance, like someone looking through glass. He held his snack, but rarely felt hungry. Sometimes he took a bite just to avoid drawing attention. Other times, not even that. He walked through the courtyard without a clear destination, dodging groups, avoiding eye contact. He had learned to quickly identify the places where he was not welcome and to stay far away from them. There were days when he tried to sit on a more isolated bench, but it only took someone looking at him twice for the discomfort to surface. So he stood up, changed places, pretended he was just walking. It was exhausting, not physically, emotionally. That was how Clark found the library. At first, it was not a conscious choice. It was almost an accident. One day, tired of wandering aimlessly, he went in simply to escape the noise. And something changed. The library was quiet, but not a hostile quiet. It was a welcoming silence. The tall walls, the full shelves, the smell of old paper. Everything seemed to say the same thing. Here, no one needs to prove anything. There, Clark was not observed, not judged, not compared. He could sit down, open a book, and simply exist. Over time, the library stopped being a hiding place and became a refuge, a place where the world seemed to make more sense. Clark began spending every recess there. At first, he sat near the door, as if still ready to flee. Later, he ventured farther inside, between the shelves. Books became his silent companions. Stories, formulas, explanations, ideas. While the people around him seemed interested only in being seen, books offered something different: depth. Clark discovered that learning calmed him. When he read, the noise of the school disappeared. Cruel laughter grew distant. Mean comments lost their power. It was as if for a few minutes he could step out of his own body, that body that always seemed wrong, and live only in his mind. And his mind was an organized place. Clark had an ease with understanding complex concepts, not because he was an extraordinary genius, but because he possessed something rare: focus. While many were distracted by conversations and jokes, he immersed himself in the material. He studied attentively, reread when he did not understand, wrote everything down. He did not study to impress anyone. He studied because it gave him a sense of control, a sense that at least there he was competent. Teachers began to notice. Clark's grades were always high, his assignments well done, his answers complete. Some teachers praised him discreetly. Others drew the class's attention to his essays or solutions. Clark felt a mix of pride and discomfort in those moments. Pride because he knew he was capable, discomfort because he felt the looks fall on him once again. When the teacher said, "Very well, Clark," some classmates rolled their eyes, others whispered, and there were those who simply confirmed in silence that he was still different. Recognition came, but never from the place he desired. His classmates did not see him as intelligent. They saw him as strange, as someone who only knew how to study, and that, in the cruel logic of school, was not a virtue. Clark realized early that studying placed him in another kind of isolation. He was not excluded only because of his appearance, but also because of his behavior. While many valued popularity, he valued knowledge. While many sought external approval, he found internal comfort. Without realizing it, he was building something solid within himself. The days repeated themselves with the same structure: classes, recess in the library, silence, reading. It was a simple routine, but a necessary one. There were moments when Clark wondered if it was enough, if studying and hiding was truly living. But he quickly pushed those thoughts away. Living, for him at that moment, was surviving, and surviving required strategy. Clark began to stand out even more academically. He participated in school competitions, was invited to projects, received extra books. But outside the classroom, he remained invisible. No one invited him to parties, no one asked how he was doing. No one was interested in who he was beyond the grades. He accepted this with a strange kind of premature maturity, as if he had understood too early that the world is not fair, only functional, and he was finding a way to function. In the library, Clark also learned to observe. He observed people, behaviors, relationships. He saw how the popular kids laughed loudly, but seemed insecure when alone. He saw how some mocked others to hide their own fears. He saw how the approval of others was a fragile currency. These silent observations shaped his view of the world. Clark began to understand that there were invisible forces guiding people: fear of rejection, desire for belonging, need for validation. And paradoxically, he was outside this game, not because he was better, but because he had never been invited to play. Over time, the pain of exclusion began to turn into something else. It did not disappear, but it changed form. It became determination. Clark began to study not just to pass the year, but to go beyond. He dreamed in silence of a future far from that place, a future where he would not have to shrink to fit. He did not speak of these dreams, not even to himself sometimes, but they existed, carefully guarded. The library was where those dreams breathed. Meanwhile, outside, the school continued its habitual rhythm: laughter, jokes, cruelties disguised as humor. Clark knew he could not hide there forever. He felt, even without being able to explain it, that something was building, a tension in the air, a silent expectation, as if that fragile balance was about to break. He did not know yet when, or how, but he knew that sooner or later, the world outside would demand more than silence. And in that moment, as he closed yet another book and prepared to return to class, Clark felt a strange sensation, difficult to explain, impossible to ignore. Something was about to happen, something that could not be read in books, something that could not be avoided with silence, something that would be seen by everyone. And for the first time in a long while, Clark felt fear not of what he might lose, but of what he was about to face. Until that day, Clark believed he already knew what humiliation was. He believed that the muffled laughter, the whispered nicknames, and the sideways glances were the worst a person could endure. He believed that the imposed silence, the constant exclusion, and the daily loneliness were already difficult enough limits. But he had not yet learned one important thing. There is always a deeper bottom. That day began like any other. Clark woke up early, put on the uniform carefully pressed by his mother, ate in silence, and left home with his backpack on his shoulders and his thoughts far away. There was no premonition. There was no warning. At school, the hallways were more crowded than usual. There was a different buzz in the air, a collective excitement he did not understand. People whispered, laughed, pointed at something, or someone. Clark felt a strange discomfort, but kept going. He had already learned to ignore bad sensations. Most of the time, they led to nothing, or at least that was what he told himself. During class, he noticed more frequent looks in his direction. When he raised his head, faces quickly turned away. When he lowered it, he heard giggles. His heart began to beat faster. He tried to focus on the material, tried to write, tried to pretend that nothing was happening, but something was. At recess, as he left the classroom, Clark felt it. He felt it even before he saw it. The courtyard was full, more full than usual. A circle of students was forming near the center, as if something important were about to happen. Clark tried to change direction, tried to go unnoticed, but someone called him. "Hey, Clark!" The name echoed too loudly, loud enough for others to look, loud enough for the circle to open. He stopped. The world seemed to shrink, concentrating on that specific space. Each step he took toward the center felt heavier than the last. And then he saw it. It was not a person. It was a situation, something that involved his name, his image, his existence. Laughter exploded. Not isolated laughter, collective laughter, loud, cruel. Clark's face heated up instantly, his stomach churn, his hands tremble. Someone made a comment too loud, another imitated the way he walked, another joked about his appearance. The words came from all sides. It was impossible to identify a single voice, as if the entire school had decided to speak at the same time. Clark tried to breathe, tried to keep his face neutral, tried not to react. He knew from experience that reacting only fit it. "Stay strong," he told himself. "Don't show weakness. This will pass." But it didn't. Someone stepped forward. Another moved closer. The circle closed in more. Now there was nowhere to go. Clark's eyes burned. He blinked quickly, trying to hold back the tears. He clenched his jaw, straightened his posture. For a few seconds, which felt like minutes, he managed. He stood there, motionless, while they laughed, while they pointed, while they turned him into entertainment. But no one can be strong forever. One specific sentence cut through the general noise, a simple sentence, direct, and something broke. It was not immediate, it was not explosive, it was like an internal crack that spread too fast to be contained. His chest tightened, his breathing failed, the world blurred. Clark felt the first tear run before he even realized he was crying. When he realized it, it was already too late. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. For a moment, no one said anything. The entire school seemed to watch that exact moment, the moment he broke. Clark felt shame, a shame so great it felt physical, as if his skin were wrong, as if he wanted to leave his own body. He tried to wipe his face quickly, tried to pull himself together, but the tears did not obey. More came, and more. Someone laughed again. Another commented something he could not quite hear. That was when Clark realized a painful truth. He was crying in front of everyone, not just a few classmates, but the entire school. That was too much. Without thinking, he turned and ran. He ran without asking permission. He ran without looking back. He ran like someone fleeing something he cannot face. His footsteps echoed through the hallways. His breathing was short. His heart felt like it wanted to burst out of his chest. He pushed the school door open forcefully and kept running. He didn't know exactly where he was going. He only knew he needed to get away from there. The tears flowed freely now, mixed with the wind on his face, with the pain in his chest. Each step felt like a silent plea for that day to end. When he finally reached home, he opened the door in a rush, went inside, and slammed it shut behind him. He threw his backpack on the floor, leaned against the wall, and then, far from the looks, far from the laughter, far from the school, Clark collapsed. He cried like he hadn't cried in years. He cried without trying to hold back, without trying to appear strong. He cried for what had happened that day, but also for everything that had been happening for a long time. For every swallowed silence, every ignored offense, every moment he felt too small to exist. There, alone at home, Clark was not the strange boy. He was not the target. He was not the different one. He was just a wounded child. And in that moment of deep pain, when it seemed that nothing could ease the weight on his chest, the door opened and someone came in. Someone who would bring no judgment, no laughter, no demands, only comfort.
Clark was still leaning against the wall when he heard the sound of the door opening. He did not lift his head. He did not try to pull himself together. He did not wipe his face. There was no strength left to pretend. The backpack remained fallen on the floor, forgotten, as if it represented everything he no longer wanted to carry. The crying had lessened but had not stopped. Now it came in silent, deep waves, as if his body were too tired even to suffer out loud. Clark's mother entered slowly. She did not call his name right away. She did not ask hurried questions. She simply saw him. She saw her son sitting on the floor, too tall for that position, his knees bent awkwardly, his shoulders slumped, his face hidden in his hands. She saw something no mother ever wants to see, the raw suffering of someone who no longer knows how to endure. She closed the door behind her carefully, set her purse down on the table, approached in silence, sat down on the floor beside him. Clark felt her presence before hearing any words. He felt the familiar warmth. He felt the known scent. He felt something he had not felt for hours: safety. Clark's mother did not ask for explanations. She did not say, "Everything will be okay." She did not try to minimize the pain. She simply wrapped her arms around Clark. The hug was not tight, nor weak. It was exactly the size of the pain he was carrying, and that was enough for everything to surface again. Clark cried more. He cried like someone who finally finds permission to be weak, like someone who no longer needs to defend himself. His mother let him. She ran her hand through his hair slowly, waited, respected the time. She knew there were pains that can only be explained after they are fully felt. When the crying began to subside, she spoke, softly, calmly. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" Clark tried to answer immediately, but his voice failed. He swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and told her. He did not tell everything at once. The words came broken, confused. He spoke about school, about the laughter, about the circle of people, about the moment he felt he could not take it anymore. He spoke of the shame, the fear, the feeling of being wrong. As he spoke, his mother listened, without interrupting, without correcting, without offering ready-made solutions. She did not say the others were wrong, though she knew they were. She did not say it would pass quickly, though she hoped it would. She listened, and by listening, she validated something Clark had never truly felt before, that his pain was real. When he finished, a silence settled between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, a full silence. His mother took a deep breath before speaking again. "Son, do you know why this hurts so much?" Clark shook his head no. She looked at him with tenderness, but also with firmness, the kind of firmness that does not hurt, but supports. "Because you are different." Clark felt his chest tighten again. She noticed. "And that is not a flaw." He raised his eyes, confused. His mother continued. "The world, especially when we are young, does not know how to deal with those who don't fit easily, so it tries to push, to shape, to hurt, until the person gives up being who they are." She paused briefly, choosing her words. "But there is one thing no one has told you yet." Clark listened like never before. "Time reveals the value of people." The sentence seemed too simple, almost ordinary, but spoken in that moment, it gained weight. "Not everyone shines early," his mother continued. "Some people need time. They need to grow on the inside before they are seen on the outside." Clark remained silent. She gently touched his face, wiping away a tear that still insisted on falling. "You are not weak for crying. You are not smaller for suffering, and you are not less important because today they cannot see you." She leaned in a little closer. "One day, son, the same people who laugh today will have to learn to listen." Clark felt something different when he heard those words. It was not joy. It was not immediate relief. It was something more subtle. Hope. Not a hope exaggerated, full of grand promises, but a calm hope, steady, like a seed planted in the right place. His mother did not say everything would change quickly. She did not promise immediate justice. She did not guarantee the pain would disappear. She said something far more important, that this did not define who he was. Clark thought about that while they remained seated on the floor. He thought about everything he had lived through. He thought about how he had tried to hide. He thought about the silence he used as a shield. And for the first time, he considered a different idea. Maybe that silence was not the end. Maybe it was only the beginning. His mother stood up slowly and held out his hand to him. "Let's get up," she said gently. "You don't need to face the world today. You just need to rest." Clark took her hand, and as he stood up, something inside him felt less heavy. Not because the pain was gone, it was still there, but because now that pain had meaning, it had context, it had direction. He knew those words would not solve everything at once, but he knew with a calm certainty that he would never forget them. They would stay there, stored, like a silent reminder that time does not erase who we are, it reveals it. Clark went to his room, lay down on the bed still dressed, his body tired, his mind full. As he stared at the ceiling, he repeated his mother's words in his mind, again and again. And for the first time since he had arrived home from school, he fell asleep. Not a peaceful sleep, but a possible one. A few hours later, already near the end of the afternoon,
Clark was awakened by a soft sound, knocking at the door. He frowned, confused. He did not expect visitors. He did not want to see anyone. His mother approached the door before he could get up. "Clark," she called in a low voice. "There's someone here to see you." His heart raced. "Who?" he asked, insecure. There was a brief pause, and then his mother replied, "A classmate from school." Clark felt his stomach tighten. He did not know what to expect. He did not know who it would be. He did not know why. All he knew was that this visit was not part of his routine. And in that instant, something told him that the day was not yet done surprising him.
Clark took a few seconds to move after hearing the words, "a classmate from school." His heart was beating too fast for something he could not understand. His first reaction was fear. Fear that it was another joke. Fear that someone had come to finish what had started at school. Fear that the suffering of that day had not been left outside the door. He got up slowly from the bed, feeling his body heavy, as if each step required more energy than it should. He ran a hand over his face, trying to hide his still swollen eyes. He took a deep breath. When he reached the living room, his mother was near the door, her hand on the doorknob. She looked at Clark with a calm expression that seemed to say, "Trust." And then the door opened. On the other side was Mary. She did not step inside immediately. She stood there for a second, as if unsure whether she should be in that place. Mary was not someone who drew attention at first glance. She did not wear flashy clothes. She did not have a confident posture. She did not have that glow that makes people turn their heads when someone walks by. She was ordinary, and precisely because of that, almost invisible. She wore the school uniform simply. Her hair was tied back carelessly, as if it had been done without much concern. Her face carried a shy but sincere expression. Clark recognized her immediately. They were not close. They never had been. Mary sat a few rows ahead of him in some classes. Sometimes they exchanged quick glances. Sometimes they shared the same space during group projects without talking much. But she had always been there, discreet, observing. "Hi," she said, her voice low, almost as if asking permission to speak. Clark replied with a shy nod of his head. He did not know what to say. His mother sensed the mood and gently intervened. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said, casting a calm look at her son before stepping away. Mary took a step forward, then another. She stopped a few meters from Clark. The silence between them was not awkward. It was careful, as if both were trying to not break something fragile. It was Mary who spoke first. "I heard about what happened today." Clark felt his stomach tighten. His body reacted automatically, as if expecting an attack. But it did not come. "I'm really sorry," she continued. "Truly." She said nothing else for a few seconds, and that made all the difference. There was no excessive curiosity. There were no invasive questions. There were no attempts to minimize. Only empathy. Clark looked away, embarrassed. "You didn't have to come," he murmured. Mary frowned slightly. "You did," she replied. "No one should go through that alone." The sentence was simple, but it struck Clark in a way he did not expect. No one had ever said something like that to him before. They sat down on the couch, with a certain distance between them. Mary held her hands together, pressing her fingers against each other. Clark kept his shoulders stiff, as if he were still defending himself. For a few minutes, they spoke little. They commented on school, on teachers, on small things, until, without noticing, the conversation changed tone.
"You really like studying, don't you?" Mary asked with a discreet smile. Clark hesitated before answering. "Yeah, I guess so." "I think it's cool," she said. "You always seem so focused, like the world gets quieter when you're reading." Clark looked at her surprised. No one had ever described it that way before. "That's more or less it," he replied. "When I study, it feels like I'm at peace." Mary nodded slowly. "I understand." She told him that she also felt out of place at school, that she didn't fit into the groups, that many times she preferred to observe rather than participate. "The difference," she said honestly, "is that you have the courage to be who you are, even when it hurts." Clark felt something shift inside him. "I don't have any courage," he replied. "I just stay quiet." Mary smiled softly. Sometimes staying quiet is courage too. That conversation was not long, but it was deep. They talked about fear, about loneliness, about how exhausting it was to try to fit in all the time. Clark noticed something strange. He was talking, really talking, without measuring every word, without rehearsing answers, without worrying about judgment. Mary listened attentively. She did not interrupt. She did not correct. She did not try to fix him. She simply saw him. At a certain moment, Clark realized that he did not feel ashamed. He did not feel like hiding. He did not feel the need to protect himself. He felt seen, not as the strange boy, not as the target, not as the different one, but as Clark. When Mary stood up to leave, it was already getting dark. She walked toward the door slowly, as if she also did not want that moment to end. Before she left, she turned to Clark. "If you want, we can talk again." Clark nodded quickly. "I'd like that." Mary smiled, a simple smile, but genuine. When the door closed, Clark stood still for a few seconds, looking at the place where she had been. Something had changed. Not in the world, not at school, not in others, but in him. For the first time, Clark felt that maybe he was not completely alone, that maybe there was someone who could see beyond appearances, beyond the silence. And as he went upstairs to his room, an idea began to form, shy but insistent. Maybe that visit had not just been a gesture of kindness. Maybe it was the beginning of something bigger, something he did not know how to name, but that for the first time, he was not afraid to feel.
Friendship did not arise from a specific moment. There was no clearly defined before and after. It simply began to seep in, occupying spaces that had once been empty, too silent to be noticed. Clark started to notice Mary in the details, in the way she arrived without making noise, in how she sat beside him without asking if she could, in the habit of waiting for him to finish organizing his own thoughts before speaking. At first, the conversations were short, comments about the day, about teachers, about assignments no one liked doing. But there was something different. Neither of them tried to seem interesting. There was no effort to impress. They simply were. And that, for Clark, was something new. He was used to defending himself, to measuring words, to anticipating rejection. With Mary, he did not feel that need. The days began to repeat themselves, and repetition brought intimacy. They started looking for each other with their eyes even before getting close. If they did not meet, the day felt incomplete, even though neither of them put it into words. Clark began to smile more. Not that forced smile used as a shield, but a discreet, involuntary one. Mary noticed and smiled back.
Over time, the conversations stopped being about the outside world and began to touch what was inside. Clark spoke about the constant fear of not being enough, about the feeling of always being on the margins, watching life happen for others. He spoke about the episode of humiliation, not with anger, but with exhaustion. Mary listened to everything, without expressing shock, without trying to minimize it, without saying it will pass as a way to close an uncomfortable subject. She simply said she understood. And when she said that, Clark believed her. Mary also began to open up. She spoke about feeling invisible, about never being chosen first, about watching people form groups, couples, stories, while she remained on the outside. They laughed about it, a light laugh, almost sad, because they laughed from the same place. Support became mutual in a natural way. When Clark withdrew, Mary started a conversation. When Mary seemed distant, Clark noticed. There were no demands, there were no expectations, there was presence. And slowly, something began to change. Clark started noticing the way Mary gestured when she got excited, the way she furrowed her brow when thinking, the calm she carried even when talking about difficult things. Mary began to see Clark's silence as something full of meaning, not as absence. She learned to read his looks, to know when he wanted to speak and when he simply needed company. The feeling was not announced. There was no moment when someone said, "I'm starting to like you." It simply emerged, discreet, implicit, almost shy. Clark noticed first, not because he was more attentive, but because fear arrived sooner. He felt something different when Mary did not show up. He felt a strange emptiness when she stepped away to talk to other people. He felt the urge to protect her, even though he did not know exactly from what. That scared him. Clark knew the world he lived in. He knew how looks worked. He knew how judgments were born. He knew the price paid for showing feelings outside the accepted standard. He knew, above all, that anything associated with him usually became a target. Mary felt it too, but she felt it from another place. For her, the fear did not come from direct rejection, but from exposure. She knew that if that bond were named, it would be analyzed, commented on, distorted. She knew that what was purest between them could be turned into a reason for mockery, and that saddened her deeply. There was a day when they stayed silent longer than usual. It was not a comfortable silence. It was dense. Clark wanted to say something. Mary did too. They looked at each other for a few seconds, as if both were standing on the edge of an invisible decision. Clark took a deep breath. He said he was afraid, not of what he felt, but of what the world would do with it. Mary was not surprised. She nodded slowly. She said she was afraid too, that she liked what they had the way it was, that she feared losing the safety they had built if they tried to turn it into something public. There was no argument. There was no drama. There was understanding. They decided, without formalizing it, not to assume anything, not to label it, not to challenge an environment that had already been cruel enough. They would continue together, close, present, but they would keep the feeling in the most protected place they could find, shared silence. On the outside, they were just friends. On the inside, they were refuge. That decision brought momentary peace, but it also planted something inevitable. Because feelings do not stagnate. They either grow or retreat, and in this case, they were growing in a space too small to contain them. The days passed. Time moved forward without asking permission. Changes began to announce themselves. Conversations about the future arose, plans that did not perfectly align. Clark realized that life was beginning to pull them in different directions. Mary felt it too. They still met, they still talked, they still laughed, but something had changed in the air, as if both knew that that phase had an expiration date. Not for lack of feeling, but because not every connection is meant to last forever in the same form. One late afternoon, Mary mentioned almost casually a possible move, an opportunity, a new path. Clark felt the impact before he understood the words. He did not try to stop her. He did not ask her to stay. He did not dramatize. He simply listened. Because deep down, he already knew. Some people come into our lives to teach us that we are worthy of connection, not to remain. As they said goodbye that day, neither of them spoke of farewell, but both felt it. And in the silence that followed, a certainty began to form. The separation would not be an abrupt break. It would be a gradual distancing, painful, inevitable. And what united them, the sensitivity, the care, the silence, would be exactly what would make the farewell so difficult.
The news did not arrive as an immediate shock. It arrived as something that had already been in the air, merely waiting to be named. Clark was accepted into college. When he saw the result, there was no exaggerated celebration. There were no shouts, no euphoria. There was silence, a heavy silence, laden with meanings that could not fit into words. He knew what it represented, not just an academic achievement, but a definitive displacement, a change of city, of routine, of life. It was the kind of victory that charges an invisible price. When he told his mother, she smiled with restrained pride. She said he deserved it, that it was only the beginning. Clark agreed, but something inside him remained unmoved. Telling Mary was different. He rehearsed the conversation for days, imagined reactions, possible responses, tried to predict emotions, and failed every time. When he finally spoke, there was no surprise on her face. There was understanding. Mary already expected it. She congratulated him, said she was happy, said it was important. And it was. But between the words, there were pauses that were far too long. They walked together that day, as they had so many other times. The path was familiar, the benches, the corridors, the silences. Everything the same, and yet everything different. Clark explained the move, spoke about the course, about the new routine that did not yet exist. Mary listened, commented little, asked practical questions. Neither of them spoke about us, because there had never been a formal us, and perhaps that was exactly why it hurt so much. Before parting, they exchanged vague promises, promises that demand no real commitment. We'll stay in touch, of course. We won't lose each other. Kind phrases, easy phrases, phrases that time usually disproves. In the first days after the move, there was still effort, frequent messages, accounts of daily life, attempts to maintain closeness through words. Clark spoke about the new city, about the buildings, about classrooms full of strangers, about fear disguised as excitement. Mary spoke about the routine that remained, about school, about the same faces, about the same places. There was care, but there was no longer presence. As the weeks passed, the messages began to space out, not because of declared disinterest, but because of emotional exhaustion. Clark was busy learning how to survive in a new environment. Mary was busy trying to not feel abandoned, even though nothing had ever been promised. Replies took longer, conversations shortened.
Topics became generic. The intimacy that once emerged from shared silence now had to compete with notifications, schedules, commitments. Clark noticed, but he did not know how to act. Every attempt to reclaim depth felt forced, as if time had created a distance that could no longer be ignored. Mary felt it too, but she chose silence. She did not demand, did not ask for explanations, did not ask why he took so long to reply. Because demanding would mean admitting a loss that had never been officially acknowledged. And so the bond began to unravel in the most painful way possible, without conflict. There were no fights, there were no accusations, there was no dramatic final meeting. There was gradual forgetting. Clark began to live his new life more intensely. New classmates, new demands, new versions of himself. Mary continued to occupy the space she had always occupied, that of the observer. She watched Clark drift away through increasingly rare messages, through shorter replies, through the absence of deep questions, and she understood. Some people do not leave us because they want to. They leave because the world pulls them away. With time, Clark began to remember Mary in specific moments, when something made him laugh unexpectedly, when he needed silence, when he felt out of place. But he did not write, because writing would require facing something he still did not know how to name. Mary remembered too, in the same places, at the same times, in the pauses between one activity and another. But she did not write either, because some absences must be respected so they do not turn into humiliation. Contact became sporadic, then rare, then non-existent. There was no exact day when they stopped talking, only a day when they realized they no longer did. Clark moved on. Mary moved on. And what remained between them was not a clear ending, but an empty space, full of unresolved meanings. Years later, Clark would still remember that connection, not with sharp pain, but with a serene melancholy. Because some people do not walk with us to the end of the road, they only show us that the road exists. Mary, in turn, would carry that memory as a silent milestone, not as regret, but as proof that at some point she had truly been seen. Time did not destroy what existed, it merely transformed it. It transformed closeness into memory, presence into absence, affection into an internal reference. And, without realizing it, both learned something essential. Not every story needs closure to have meaning. Some exist only to prepare us for who we will become afterward. Time passed without asking permission. There was no exact moment when Clark stopped being the insecure boy and became the man who now occupied expansive rooms surrounded by glass, concrete, and high-impact decisions. The change did not happen all at once. It was slow, almost imperceptible, built through ordinary days, long nights, and silent choices. Clark was now an adult, and that was evident even before he said a single word. Tall, as he had always been, but now with a firm posture. Not thin, strong. Not strong in a showy way, but structurally strong. The kind of body shaped by discipline, not vanity. His face, once marked by acne and insecurity, now carried defined features, clean skin, a more pronounced jawline, and his eyes were what drew the most attention. They were not arrogant, they were steady, the gaze of someone who had endured enough discomfort to no longer need to prove anything to anyone. The braces were long gone, so were the oversized clothes. Clark dressed with restraint, nothing flashy, nothing excessive. Everything seemed to communicate the same message: control. When he entered any environment, people noticed, some out of admiration, others out of curiosity, others out of immediate respect, even without knowing exactly why. He had become the CEO of a well-regarded company in the technology sector, a company that had not been born large, but had grown with consistency. Clark inherited nothing. He built everything. He started as an analyst, then a coordinator, then a director. Always quiet, always efficient. He was never the most charismatic person in the room, but invariably, he was the most prepared. While others spoke to be seen, Clark spoke when it was necessary. And when he spoke, everyone listened. The market took notice. Invitations to speak began to appear. Articles in specialized magazines, awards that he accepted with a contained, almost uncomfortable smile, photographs at events, handshakes, flashes. To those observing from the outside, Clark was a model of success, the classic story of overcoming adversity that people love to tell, as long as they do not have to know the details. But the past had not been erased. It had simply learned how to behave. In specific moments, usually at night when the pace slowed, Clark found himself remembering, not specific humiliations, not isolated faces, but the feeling. That old feeling of being out of place, of needing to adapt to the environment in order not to be crushed by it. It was curious to realize that even at the top, the body still remembered. In important meetings, when everyone awaited his decision, there was a second of internal silence, a distant echo, a memory that whispered, "Don't make a mistake." Not for fear of professional failure, but from an older fear, the fear of becoming invisible again. Clark never spoke about this with anyone. To the world, he was confident, decisive, secure, and he was. But confidence is not the absence of a past, it is coexistence with it. His office reflected that. Minimalistic, organized, nothing overly personal. No childhood photos, no excessive display of trophies. Just books, many books, some technical, others philosophical. And on a discreet shelf, almost hidden, an old notebook, untitled, without a striking cover, an object no one ever asked about, and one he would never explain. Clark had learned to control the external narrative, but he did not try to erase the internal one. Perhaps because he knew it was precisely that narrative that had brought him there. Public recognition grew. Employees admired him, partners respected him, competitors watched him with caution. He was seen as someone who had made it. And ironically, the higher he rose, the more silent he became. There was no euphoria. There was no ostentation. There was focus. There was responsibility. Clark understood that success is not only about reaching a place, it's about sustaining it. In interviews, when asked about his trajectory, he answered objectively. He spoke of effort, of study, of opportunity. He never romanticized suffering. He never dramatized the past, because those who truly suffered learn early that pain is not a marketing tool. Still, something remained alive. Sometimes when he saw insecure young interns, Clark lingered longer than necessary in simple conversations. He asked how they were doing, whether they needed anything. Not for pity, but for a silent recognition. He knew exactly what it was like to occupy that place. And there was another detail. Amid so many achievements, there was a constant absence. Clark had never built a deep relationship since Mary. Not for lack of interest from others, offers were not scarce, but there was always an invisible barrier, a caution, a controlled emotional distance. He became involved, but never fully surrendered, as if a part of him were still anchored to something that had never had closure. He did not think of Mary every day, but she appeared in unexpected moments, a specific comment, a shy look in the middle of a crowd, a sensation of being seen without judgment. Clark never sought her out, not from indifference, but from a mixture of respect, guilt, and fear. Fear of discovering that time had done what he never had the courage to do, end it completely. And then, on a day that seemed like just another item in his crowded schedule, the past decided to reappear. Clark was arriving at a large corporate event, the launch of a new product. Press gathered, high expectations. He crossed the lobby with firm steps, accompanied by advisors, when he was interrupted by a voice far too animated for such a formal environment. A voice that did not ask for attention, it demanded it. "Mr. Clark, I'm a huge fan of yours." Clark turned for courtesy, and in the instant his eyes met the face in front of him, something inside him was pulled back many years in time. It was not immediate, it was not rational, it was physical, a tightening in his chest, a recognition that came before the name. The past was there, standing, smiling, unaware of who Clark had once been. Clark walked toward the main auditorium with the posture that time had taught him to maintain. The event was impeccably organized, lined carpets, calculated lighting, journalists strategically positioned. Everything worked as it should. It was just another lecture, another launch, another rehearsed speech. Or at least that was how it seemed. He was crossing the building's lobby when he heard the voice. "Mr. Clark." It was a male voice, too young for that exaggerated tone of reverence. Clark slowed his pace by reflex and turned naturally, as he had done hundreds of times at events like this. The young man wore a doorman's uniform, well-pressed, clean, a badge hanging from his chest. There was excitement in his eyes, an open, almost childlike smile. "I'm a huge fan of yours." Clark nodded with automatic politeness. That kind of approach was no longer new to him. "I've followed your career for years. What you've built is inspiring." The young man took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for something important. "I would really like an opportunity, anything at all. It doesn't even have to be big, just a chance." Clark kept his face composed, but something inside him began to stir. The voice, the tilt of the head, the smile. It wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. The memory came like a sharp blow, not an organized recollection with a beginning, middle, and end, but a cluster of sensations. The schoolyard, the collective laughter, the shove disguised as a joke, words thrown with precise cruelty. Clark recognized that face, not as it was now, but as it had been. The aggressor. The boy who laughed loudly when Clark stumbled, who pulled at his belongings, who made comments just sharp enough to provoke laughter, but never explicit enough to bring punishment. The same smile, the same expression of someone who never believed that any of it would leave scars. The world around him seemed to slow down for a second. Clark was 16 again, a body too tall for its own coordination, restless hands, the desire to disappear. That same young man had been a constant presence back then, not the leader of the bullying, but the silent executor, the one who takes advantage when the opportunity appears. Clark felt his stomach tighten. It was not pure hatred, it was something more complex. Old anger, forgotten vulnerability, an instinctive desire to give back, even if only with words, everything that had once been taken from him. For a fraction of a second, Clark thought about saying who he was. He thought about shattering that image, about watching the smile disappear. He thought about symbolic revenge. But that thought brought no satisfaction. It brought fatigue. He realized something that had not existed when he was young: the power to choose. The doorman kept talking, unaware of the internal storm in front of him. He spoke of dedication, effort, the desire to grow. Clark listened, but inside he carried on a silent dialogue. If I react the way he expects, I remain trapped in that schoolyard. If I humiliate him now, what actually changes? Who walks away bigger from this scene? The answer came effortlessly. Clark took a deep breath, straightened his posture even more, looked directly into the young man's eyes. There was no contempt, there was no irony, there was control. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, in a firm, neutral voice. "Nothing I built was done alone. There was a lot of learning along the way." The young man smiled even more, encouraged. Clark continued, "As for opportunities, the most important thing is to keep preparing yourself. Sometimes the right moment arrives when we least expect it." He paused briefly, measured, precise. "I'll give your case careful thought." They were simple words, no concrete promise, no explicit lie, but enough to ignite hope. The doorman thanked him, visibly moved. He straightened up, proud, as if that brief exchange had validated something deep within him. Clark nodded one last time and headed toward the auditorium. Each step took him physically further from the young man, but emotionally, he was still there. He sat backstage waiting to be announced. The murmur of the audience reached him muffled. Clark closed his eyes for a moment. He felt the weight of that encounter, not because the past had won, but because he had finally understood something essential. He did not need to prove anything. He did not need to rewrite history with inverted humiliation. The boy who had cried one day had not disappeared, but he no longer commanded his actions. Clark had chosen dignity. And in that moment, he understood that maturity is not forgetting the past. It is not allowing it to dictate who you will be now. When his name was announced, Clark stood. He walked onto the stage with firm steps. Applause filled the auditorium. No one there knew what had just happened. No one imagined the silent battle that had preceded that moment. And that did not matter. Because for the first time, Clark felt something different when facing his own past. Freedom.
The auditorium was full, not only of people, but of intentions. The press conference began like all the others. Microphones aligned, cameras adjusted, lights far too strong for someone not accustomed to being watched all the time. Clark was seated at the main table, with the company's logo projected behind him. To his left, directors. To his right, representatives from the technical sector. All attentive, prepared, trained. But Clark was not entirely there. He had answered the first questions with precision, data, projections, strategy. The audience reacted with approving murmurs. Pens scratched across notepads. Keys were pressed with urgency. It was a familiar game. More experienced reporters advanced without ceremony. They interrupted. They raised their voices. They fought for every second of attention as if it defined personal relevance. Clark observed, not with judgment, but with detachment. He already knew that kind of hunger. While answering a question about international expansion, his eyes began to scan the room without conscious intent. An old habit, an automatic search for something he himself did not know how to name. And then it happened. It was not an impact. It was not a shock. It was a gentle interruption. Among shoulders thrust forward, arms extended with recorders, cameras pushing against one another, there was someone who did not advance. A reporter remained a few steps back. She held her notebook firmly, but without aggression. The microphone was low, close to her chest. Her body slightly inclined forward, like someone who wants to participate but is unsure if she has the right. She observed more than she spoke. Clark felt something shift. It was not ordinary curiosity. It was recognition without logic. He looked away for a second, as if his brain needed to confirm it. He looked back, and then he saw what he had not seen in years. That look. Not the eyes themselves, but the way they remained attentive even when ignored. The world around him seemed to lose volume. Clark did not remember exactly the color of Mary's eyes, but he remembered that expression, the mixture of shyness and depth, of care and presence. The reporter lifted her gaze at that instant, and their eyes met. It was brief, very brief, but enough. Time did not rewind. There was no immediate dramatic flashback. There was internal silence. Clark felt his chest tighten in a way he had not felt in a long time. Not like pain, like emotional memory. It was her. There was no doubt. Mary. Older, more mature, but unmistakable. The same way of observing the world as if she were always trying to not get in the way. The same care not to occupy too much space. She recognized him at the same instant. But unlike him, Mary looked away first. As if she had been caught doing something improper, as if looking too much were an intrusion. Clark noticed the gesture, and something inside him moved. Mary knew who he was, of that he had no doubt. But what he saw on her face was not immediate joy, it was restraint. She did not smile. She did not show exaggerated surprise. There was a strange calm, as if she had long since accepted that he belonged to a world distant from hers. Clark thought Mary would not remember, not because time had erased it, but because, in her logic, important people do not carry small memories, and she had always considered herself too small to remain in the memory of someone like him. Clark answered two more questions automatically, but his attention was no longer there. He watched Mary between one answer and another, the way she took notes, how she waited for an opening that never came. The major outlets dominated the space. Well-known reporters took turns. Mary did not impose herself, not for lack of competence, but for something deeper, the habit of yielding space. Clark recognized that with discomfort. It was the same behavior he had had in his youth. The press conference was moving towards its end. Clark felt urgency, not anxiety, urgency. The clear sensation that if he did nothing now, he would lose something again. When the moderator announced "Last question," 3 hands rose at the same time, pushing forward. Mary did not raise her hand. She closed her notebook slowly, like someone who already expected not to be seen. It was at that moment that Clark interrupted the natural flow of the event. "Before we conclude," he said, looking directly at the moderator, "I would like to hear from someone who has not spoken yet." A murmur rang through the room. Clark arose slightly from his chair and indicated with his gaze, not with his finger. "That reporter over there." Mary froze. For a second, she thought she had misunderstood. The moderator followed Clark's gaze. "Could you come forward, please?" Mary hesitated. Her heart raced. She stood up carefully,
as if each step required permission. She approached the microphone feeling all eyes upon her, something she had always avoided. Clark watched her, not as a CEO, not as a public figure, but as someone who, years earlier, had been seen by her when no one else saw. When Mary stopped fronting him, holding the microphone with both hands, Clark spoke. "Before the question, could you tell us your name?" Her voice came low, but steady. "Mary." The name passed through Clark like a belated confirmation. For an instant, he had to control himself not to reveal too much. His eyes filled, not with tears that fall, but with restrained emotion. Mary noticed, and in that silent second between them, everything that had never been said came back into existence. The past did not need to be explained. It was there, alive, breathing in the space between two gazes that never forgot.
The name hung, suspended in the air for a few seconds. Mary. There was no immediate reaction from the audience. For everyone there, it was just another name among so many others. A reporter finally being called. A formality before the last question. But for Clark, that name was not sound. It was memory. It was passage. It was a fixed point on a timeline that had never ceased to exist. He kept his face serene, trained, controlled. But inside, something was reorganizing itself. Clark realized that this moment demanded emotional precision. Any excess would reveal too much. Any retreat could mean confirming the silent fear Mary had carried for years, that she had not been important enough to remain. He could not make a mistake. "Mary," he repeated, now with measured lightness, as if confirming something to himself. She nodded, still trying to understand what was happening. The microphone trembled slightly in her hands, not from professional nervousness, but from something more intimate, something old. Mary had prepared herself to ask a technical question. She had data, she had context, she had an agenda. But she had not prepared herself to be seen in that way. Not as a reporter, as a person. Clark leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. The gesture was small, but heavy with intention. He reduced the symbolic distance that had always existed between him and anyone else in that space. "Before answering, I need to say something." The moderator hesitated for a moment, but did not interrupt. The room gradually fell silent. Something in Clark's tone had changed. He was no longer the CEO presenting a product. He was someone about to cross an invisible line. Clark took a deep breath. "Many years ago," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I met someone who saw me when I was not seen." Mary felt the ground lose its firmness for a second. She did not want to interpret that as personal. She did not want to create expectations, but her heart already recognized the path before reason could intervene. Clark continued, "That person did not need to do anything grand. She was simply present." He lifted his gaze again, direct, without avoidance. And that changes a life. The silence was now absolute. Mary swallowed hard. Her eyes began to burn, but she kept control. Years of self-restraint had taught her not to react impulsively. Still, something inside her was beginning to give way. Clark then did what she would never have expected. "I know this isn't the place," he said with honesty, "but I needed to confirm." He paused briefly. Not dramatic, necessary. "You studied with me many years ago." It was not a direct question. It was a gentle affirmation, open enough to allow retreat
if necessary. Mary felt the impact. The entire past organized itself in seconds. The bench in the courtyard, the quiet conversations, the shared silences, the farewell without closure. Mary nodded, a simple gesture, but definitive. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. Clark closed his eyes for a moment, not to regain composure, but to accept. When he opened them again, there was something different there. Not tears, but gratitude exposed for the first time in public. "I never forgot," he said, without detours. Mary felt the air leave her lungs. The sentence was short, direct, irrefutable. Everything she had presumed over the years, that he had moved on, that he had forgotten her, that she had been just a footnote, began to crumble silently. Clark continued, now aware that each word would echo beyond that room. "Time pulled us apart. Life became noisy. I should have looked for you." There was no explicit apology. There was responsibility. Mary felt her eyes fill, but she did not look away. For the first time, she did not retreat. "I thought," she began, but the sentence did not come whole. She breathed. "I thought you had more important things." Clark answered without hesitation. "You were always important." The audience began to realize that this was not staged. There was something genuine happening here, something that escaped the usual dynamics of a press conference. The moderator cleared his throat, unsure. Clark raised his hand discreetly, asking for a few more seconds, not as a CEO, but as someone who needed to conclude something that had been pending for years. "Mary," he said again, "if you allow it, I would like to talk to you afterwards, in private." She nodded before even thinking. "I would like that." That was all. There was no applause. There was no exaggerated reaction, but something had been restored. Clark then resumed his professional posture. He answered her question with genuine attention, as if that were the only dialogue of the evening. At the end, he thanked her formally. The press conference ended shortly after that. When Clark stood up and left the stage, there was no longer any doubt in him. Some stories do not end because they were interrupted. They remain open because they need to be resumed at the right time. And time finally had yielded. Mary remained standing for a few seconds after the event ended, holding the notepad that now seemed irrelevant, her heart still racing, her mind trying to keep up with what had just happened. She had not been forgotten. She never had been. And that changed everything. The past, which had once hurt for lacking answers, now breathed again, not as nostalgia, but as possibility. The reunion was not complete, but the bond had been restored. And this time, not by chance.
The building was already almost empty when Clark left the area reserved for executives. The press conference had ended. The journalists were dispersing. The buzz gave way to a spaced silence made of echoing footsteps and closing doors. Mary waited in a discreet corner of the lobby, as she always had throughout her life. Not out of absolute insecurity, but out of habit. The notepad was closed, the recorder turned off. That night was no longer professional. When Clark saw her, he walked toward her without haste. There was no urgency now. There was intention. "Thank you for staying," he said, stopping a few steps away from her. "I'm the one who should thank you. I thought maybe you might change your mind." Clark shook his head, almost smiling. "I waited years for this conversation." She felt the weight of the sentence,
not as a demand, but as truth. They decided to leave. The place did not matter, only that it was far from cameras, far from noise, far from external expectations. They went to a small cafe, open late, a few blocks from the building. A simple place, lit by yellow light, few tables occupied. They sat facing each other. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. It was strange to be so close after so much time, and at the same time, absurdly familiar. Clark was the first to break the silence. "You've changed." Mary smiled faintly. "Everyone changes." "Yes," he agreed, "but some things remain." She lifted her gaze. "Like what?" Clark took a moment to answer. "The way you observe before speaking, the way you truly listen." Mary lowered her eyes, touched. "And you," she said after a pause, "finally seem comfortable within yourself." He released a held breath, almost a soundless laugh. "It wasn't easy." "I know." And she truly did. The past began to surface naturally, without being forcefully invoked. There was no need for rigid chronology. The memories came as fragments. The bench in the courtyard, the quiet conversations, the silences that said more than words. "I thought about you a lot," Mary said, with direct honesty, "but I understood your departure as an ending." Clark rested his elbows on the table. "It was never an ending for me." She looked at him, surprised. "Then why did you never look for me?" The question carried no accusation. It carried delayed curiosity. Clark took a deep breath. "Because I thought I had already lost the right. Because I thought that if you wanted, you would have looked for me too." Mary nodded slowly. "I thought exactly the same." They looked at each other, understanding something simple and painful at the same time. Two silences had built an unnecessary absence. "I missed you," Clark said, without detours. Mary did not respond immediately. Her eyes filled. "I never stopped missing you." The sentence was not dramatic. It was a fact. The cafe around them seemed distant. Time had slowed again, not as in the public reunion, but in an intimate way. Clark extended his hand across the table. He did not touch her immediately. He waited. Mary looked at the hand, then at him, and then placed hers on top of it. The touch was simple, but definitive. "We were afraid," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but now it's different." "Why?" Clark looked at her calmly. "Because today I know who I am, and I know what I lost when I didn't have the courage." Mary felt her heart accelerate. "And what do you want now?" Clark did not answer immediately. He stood up slightly from his chair, slowly walked around the table, stopping in front of her. Mary stood up as well, without realizing when she decided to do so. They stood face to face. Clark spoke softly but firmly. "I want to continue, not from where we stopped, but from where we are now." Mary felt her breath falter. "So do I." There were no more words. Clark brought his hand to her face with absolute care, as one who recognizes something precious. Mary closed her eyes at the moment she felt the touch. The kiss was not urgent. It was not overwhelming. It was awaited. It carried years of silence, of restraint, of feeling kept without a name. When they pulled away, there was no embarrassment. There was clarity. They smiled, not like insecure adolescents, but like adults who had finally understood time. They did not need to say they would be together. The decision had already been made in the space between them. Some stories do not ask for promises, they ask for presence. And that night, Clark and Mary chose not to lose each other again. The past had been honored.
the present embraced, and the future, for the first time, did not seem frightening.
Time makes no noise when it changes people. It works in silence. Clark learned this late, perhaps because for a long time he believed he needed to defeat the past, when, in truth, he needed to understand it. That night, after saying goodbye at the cafe, there were no grand promises. They did not talk about marriage, detailed plans, or idealized futures. They simply walked together for a few blocks, side by side, feeling something rare: tranquility. Clark realized with unprecedented clarity that he never became strong despite the pain. He became strong because of it. Every forced silence in adolescence taught him to observe. Every humiliation compelled him to develop self-control. Every exclusion pushed him inward, where he built discipline, focus, and resilience. Nothing was wasted. The boy who learned to remain silent to survive became the man who learned to speak only when necessary. The young man who had to adapt in order not to be crushed became someone capable of navigating any environment without losing his center. Professional success did not erase the past. It merely gave shape to what was already being built in that solitary boy in the library. Clark understood something essential. Pain was not an accident along the way. It was the way itself. And Mary walked beside him, feeling something she had never felt before: legitimacy. For years, she believed her role in the world was to observe, support, understand, but never to occupy the center. She always saw herself as someone who passed through other people's lives without leaving deep marks. That night, this narrative began to crumble. She had not been forgotten. She had never been too small. She had never been irrelevant. Clark's silence in the past was not disinterest, it was fear. And realizing this did not inflate her ego, it healed her wound. Mary began to recognize herself as someone worthy of love, not because she was chosen now, but because she had always been deserving, even when no one confirmed it out loud. She understood that empathy is not invisibility, that sensitivity is not weakness, that taking up little space does not mean having no value. The reunion did not rewrite the past, but it gave it meaning. Clark and Mary did not return to who they once were. They continued being who they had always been, now without fear. There was no need for exaggeration, nor for cinematic endings. The strength of that story lay precisely in its restraint, because some of the greatest transformations happen without an audience, without applause, without witnesses. Time revealed something simple and profound. Clark was never weak. Mary was never small. The world simply took too long to notice. And perhaps this is one of the hardest lessons to accept. We are not always shaped by circumstances. Often, we are merely exposed by them. Time does not create. It reveals. It reveals who had the courage to continue even when unseen. It reveals who loved in silence without demanding recognition. It reveals who knew to wait without hardening the heart. Clark and Mary moved forward together not as a promise of eternal happiness, but as a conscious choice. A choice made by adults who learned, each in their own way, that it is not necessary to chase love when it is already walking beside you. And so, without haste and without noise,
the story comes to a close. Not because everything ended, but because at last, everything began at the right time.
If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, provoke reflection, and stay with you even after the video ends, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach more people. If this video resonated with you, like it and share it with someone who might need to hear this story. See you next time.